In 2020, $300,000 could buy you a home. Today, it barely buys you the same walls. You didn't get richer, your money got weaker, and someone made sure of it. While the world was distracted by lockdowns, fear, and uncertainty, a silent crime was unfolding, one that would quietly erase decades of your hard work and savings. This isn't a story about houses or prices, it's a story about power. Because between 2020 and 2022, the Federal Reserve printed for $0.5 trillion, and in doing so, it didn't just stimulate the economy. It stole 30% of your wealth, right under your nose. Most people didn't notice, some even cheered it on. But when your grocery bill doubled, your rent skyrocketed, and your paycheck stopped stretching, you felt the theft, even if you couldn't see it. And to understand how they pulled this off, we need to go back to where this entire illusion began. The Federal Reserve was born out of crisis, the financial panic of 1907, when banks collapsed, markets froze, and confidence vanished. In 1913, behind closed doors on Jekyll Island, the nation's most powerful bankers met in secret to craft a solution. They called it the Federal Reserve System, a public institution designed to protect the economy from chaos. But the truth, it was a private cartel of banks, built to control money itself. On paper, the Fed's mission was simple: manage inflation, stabilize employment, and keep prices steady. But hidden within that mission was a weapon: the power to create money out of nothing. For decades, that power remained restrained by gold. Every dollar printed had to be backed by something real. But in 1971, President Richard Nixon ended that link forever, cutting the dollar loose from gold and tying it to nothing but faith. From that moment, money wasn't value, it was debt. And the more they printed, the weaker each dollar became. Fast forward to 2008. The housing market collapses, banks crumble, and panic spreads again. The Fed steps in with a new trick: quantitative easing, printing trillions to save the system. The markets recovered, the rich got richer, but ordinary people? Their wages stayed flat while the cost of living crept higher. Still, no one questioned it because the pain was slow, hidden, invisible. But then came 2020, the year everything broke. Lockdowns froze the economy overnight, businesses died, millions lost their jobs. And to stop the bleeding, the Fed went nuclear. They printed for $0.5 trillion, more money than in the first 100 years of America's existence, and unleashed it into the financial system. The result: stocks exploded, housing soared, and the illusion of prosperity returned. But what really happened was the largest wealth transfer in modern history. Because when new money enters the system, it doesn't make everyone richer. It just makes everything more expensive for everyone who doesn't get the new money first. And the people who did get it, they weren't you. When the Federal Reserve printed for $0.5 trillion between 2020 and 2022, that money didn't go to the people who needed it most. It went to the banks, hedge funds, and corporations, the same players who already own most of America's wealth. The mechanism was simple, but devastating. The Fed began buying treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities, essentially IOUs from the government and the banks. In exchange, it created brand new money out of thin air and pumped it into the financial system. That money then flowed into stocks, real estate, and corporate debt, driving prices through the roof. Wall Street celebrated, the wealthy watched their portfolios soar. But for ordinary Americans, it triggered something far darker: a cost of living explosion that would slowly strangle the middle class. The government tried to make it look like prosperity. Remember the stimulus checks? $1,200, then $600, then $1,400. For a moment, people felt relief, as if the system finally cared. But what most didn't realize was that these checks were only a tiny fraction of the trillions created. The bulk of the money never reached Main Street. It stayed trapped in financial assets, inflating everything except the lives of the people who needed help the most. And once that new money began trickling down, it didn't bring opportunity, it brought inflation. By mid-2021, prices began to rise across the board: food, gas, rent, used cars. The essentials of life started slipping out of reach. The Fed called it transitory, the media repeated the line, but it wasn't temporary. It was systemic theft, disguised as economic policy. Because every time the Fed printed new dollars, the dollars you already owned became worth less. Imagine owning 1% of a pie, and then someone bakes another one and cuts it into the same number of slices. Your share didn't grow, the pie just got diluted. That's what inflation does. It doesn't just make things more expensive. It erases the real value of your money, your savings, your retirement fund, your labor. And yet, the elites knew exactly what they were doing. Between 2020 and 2022, billionaires in America added more than $2 trillion to their net worth. Corporate profits hit record highs. Meanwhile, the average worker's paycheck lost nearly 15% of its purchasing power. So while the Fed claimed it was stimulating the economy, what it really did was transfer wealth upward from the poor and middle class to those who already owned the system. To see the full scale of this manipulation, look at what happened to housing. In 2020, low interest rates and printed money created a frenzy. Mortgage rates hit record lows. Investors rushed in to buy homes, not to live in, but to flip or rent out. Hedge funds like BlackRock began buying entire neighborhoods. Prices skyrocketed by more than 40% in just 2 years. The same house that cost $300,000 before the pandemic was now for $150,000 or more. And for millions of young Americans, homeownership, the foundation of the American dream, slipped out of reach forever. The Fed didn't just cause inflation, it locked an entire generation out of wealth. But here's where the story turns darker. When inflation began spiraling out of control in 2022, the Fed tried to slam on the brakes. They hiked interest rates at the fastest pace in 40 years, trying to undo the very problem they created. That decision triggered chaos. Mortgage rates doubled. Borrowing costs soared. Businesses slowed. And suddenly, the same system they inflated began to deflate, crushing everyone who had believed the illusion of easy money. But notice who didn't get crushed. The people who own assets, the banks, the corporations, the investors. They adjusted, hedged, and survived. It was the working class, the small business owner, and the saver who paid the price. Because inflation doesn't just make you poorer. It makes you dependent on credit, on loans, on a system that profits from your struggle. And yet, there's one question most people still don't ask. If the Fed knew this would happen, why did they do it? The answer lies in the very nature of the system itself. Every dollar in circulation today is born as debt. When the government borrows, the Fed prints money to buy that debt. When that debt comes due, it must be repaid with interest. But the only way to pay that interest is to create even more debt. It's a self-reinforcing trap, a Ponzi scheme with official branding. So the system can never stop printing, because the moment it does, everything begins to collapse. That's why every crisis seems to have the same solution: more spending, more stimulus, more debt, more printing. Because in this economy, growth isn't built on productivity or innovation anymore. It's built on inflation, and that means your loss is their profit. By now, the pattern should look familiar. Every time the Fed saves the system, the rich get richer, and the dollar gets weaker. It happened in 2008, it happened in 2020, and unless something changes, it will happen again, only worse. Because the real danger isn't that your money is worth less today. It's that one day, it might not be worth anything at all. So, what happens when people lose faith in their money? History gives us the answer. Because this isn't the first time a powerful empire has tried to print its way out of debt. Every great civilization that abused its currency, from Rome to Spain to Britain, followed the same pattern. At first, it feels like magic. You create more coins, more paper, more wealth, people celebrate. Then the prices rise, confidence fades, the middle class disappears, and before long, the empire collapses from within. The same cycle that destroyed empires is now repeating in slow motion, right before our eyes. In ancient Rome, emperors began mixing cheap metals into their silver coins to pay for endless wars and public handouts the people didn't notice at first. But within decades, the silver denarius had lost 90% of its value. Inflation soared. Wages couldn't keep up. And by the time people realized what had happened, it was too late. The currency collapsed. The empire soon followed. Centuries later, Spain repeated the same mistake. After discovering mountains of gold and silver in the Americas, Spain flooded its economy with new money. For a few years, it looked like a golden age. Palaces were built, wealth seemed limitless. But all that imported treasure didn't make the nation stronger. It made it hollow, prices skyrocketed, workers starved. And the wealth flowed out to other countries that produced real goods instead of printing or mining money. By the 17th century, Spain, once the richest empire on earth, was bankrupt. Fast forward to Britain after World War II, the empire was drowning in debt, so it printed its way through reconstruction. The British pound, once the global reserve currency, lost more than half its value in just a few decades. And by the 1970s, the United States had replaced Britain as the world's financial superpower. But now, America is following the exact same script. When President Nixon cut the dollars linked to gold in 1971, it gave the government infinite spending power. Since then, the U.S. money supply has increased by over 7,000%. And what once cost $1 now costs 10. That's not growth. That's erosion, hidden behind the illusion of progress. You see, when a government can print its own currency, it doesn't need to raise taxes to steal your money. Inflation does it for them. It's a silent tax, the most powerful weapon the state has ever discovered. Now imagine what happens when that weapon gets out of control. When the printing presses never stop, when the debt climbs faster than production. When money becomes infinite, but value becomes meaningless. That's not economics anymore. That's the beginning of collapse. And we're already seeing the cracks. The national debt just crossed $35 trillion. That's over $100,000 for every American. Interest payments on that debt are now one of the largest expenses in the federal budget, bigger than defense. Think about that. America now spends more paying interest than defending the country. That's what happens when your currency loses credibility. Meanwhile, ordinary people are being crushed. Credit card debt just hit $1.4 trillion, an all-time high. Savings rates have plunged to record lows. And more than 60% of Americans now live paycheck to paycheck. It's not because they're lazy, it's because the system is rigged to keep them broke. The more prices rise, the harder they work just to survive. The harder they work, the more the government prints to help, and every new dollar printed steals value from the dollars they already earned. But here's the most dangerous illusion of all. People still think the Fed can fix this. They believe the same institution that caused the crisis can somehow undo it. But the truth is, the Fed isn't the firefighter, it's the arsonist. It lights the fire, then pretends to put it out, while quietly fueling the next one. And now, after printing for $0.5 trillion in 2 years, it's trapped in its own creation. If it keeps printing, inflation roars back. If it stops, the system collapses. That's not a choice, that's checkmate. For decades, the Fed has been playing a dangerous game, one that turns every crisis into an excuse for more control. First it was the housing crash, then the pandemic. Now it's inflation itself. Each time, they promise stability. Each time, they print more. And each time, the gap between the rich and the poor widens. So the question isn't if the system breaks, it's when. Because you can only steal from the future for so long before the bill comes due. And when it does, the fallout won't just be economic. It will be social, it will be political, it will be generational. And no printing press on earth can stop what's coming next. When trust in money breaks, society begins to fracture. Because money isn't just paper or numbers on a screen, it's belief. It's the glue that holds everything together. When that belief dies, everything else starts to fall apart. We've seen this movie before. When Germany's Weimar Republic printed its way out of World War I debt, a loaf of bread went from costing a few marks to billions. People carried cash in wheelbarrows, savings vanished overnight, and desperation opened the door for tyranny to walk in. That's the hidden cost of inflation, not just higher prices, but the destruction of trust, and when trust dies, so does democracy. Look around today. Anger is rising, divisions are deepening. People sense something is broken, even if they can't explain it. They know the numbers don't add up. They know they're working harder and falling behind. They know someone, somewhere, is gaming the system. And they're right, because inflation isn't an accident. It's a policy, a tool of control. Every printed dollar is a quiet act of theft, stealing from your savings to subsidize the debts of the powerful. When you work for money, and they can print it, who really holds the power? When you save for your future, and they can devalue it overnight, who's really in control? This is why the middle class keeps shrinking. This is why wealth keeps concentrating. This is why every generation feels poorer than the last. Because the game is rigged, and the currency itself is the rigging. But here's the truth they won't tell you. The dollar isn't dying because of fate. It's dying because of choice, a choice to prioritize debt over discipline, printing over productivity, control over freedom. And once a government realizes it can fund itself by destroying the value of its own money, it never stops. Not until the system collapses. Right now, the US is standing on that edge. Trillions in debt, a currency losing credibility, a public losing patience. The Fed can raise interest rates, but that only slows the bleeding. It can print more, but that only deepens the wound. There's no painless exit, only delay, only denial. But if history teaches us one thing, it's that collapse isn't the end, it's a reckoning. When old systems fail, new ones are born. Rome gave way to Europe, Britain gave way to America. And one day, America's dollar will give way to something else. The question is, who will control it next? Will it be another central bank, printing digital dollars on a screen, or will it be something decentralized, a system that no government can inflate at will? That's the crossroads we're approaching. Because inflation isn't just an economic event, it's the signal that the old world order is ending. And what comes next depends on what people choose to believe in: gold, Bitcoin, real assets. Or maybe, a brand new kind of currency altogether. Whatever it is, it will rise from the ashes of the dollar. And the people who understand what's happening now will be the ones ready for that new world. So what can you take away from all this? First, inflation isn't a mystery, it's math. When you print more money than the economy produces, each dollar buys less. Second, inflation is theft, not by thieves with masks, but by policymakers in suits. And third, you can't fight inflation by trusting the same system that caused it. You can only fight it by learning how it works and protecting yourself from it, because at the end of the day, the real war isn't between rich and poor. It's between those who understand money and those who don't, and the Fed is betting that you'll never figure it out, but now you have. So the next time you see prices rising, or hear about stimulus or money printing, you'll know exactly what's happening and who it's really for. Because this was never about saving the economy. It was about saving the system at your expense. The question is, will you keep playing their game? Or will you finally step outside it before the system collapses? The clock is ticking. The next crisis is already loading, and this time, there may be no bailout big enough to stop it. If you found this eye-opening, make sure to subscribe, because in the next video, we'll break down exactly how you can protect yourself before the next wave of inflation hits. This is not just history repeating, it's history accelerating. And if you don't prepare now, you won't get another chance.